From WKGC Public Media, this is ReelTalk, the place where you can join the cinematic conversations frame by frame each week. I'm your host, R.L. Terry. If movies are your thing, you're in the right place for today's review on the recently released horror movie Primate. Ever so often, a genre film comes along that knows exactly what it is, and more importantly, what it is not trying to be. Primate is not interested in prestige horror, elevated allegory, or winking irony. It's unapologetic when it comes to the when nature attacks movie subgenre. And refreshingly, it commits to that premise with confidence, craft, and even conviction. To my surprise, I really liked Primate quite a lot. It delivered spine-tingling chills, nightmare-fueled thrills, and a steady sense of dread that never collapses into camp or self-parody, although maybe it comes close a time or two. The pacing is solid, set pieces are effective, a very much isolated location. Pretty much the entire movie takes place in one location. And perhaps most importantly, we actually find ourselves rooting for these characters. Maybe not equal shares, but for the most part, we're rooting for these characters to survive. And in a genre where human beings often exist merely to be dispatched, that matters quite a lot. We're going to get into it later on in the show. Are there a few paper thin characters? Yeah, sure. It's a horror movie. But most are developed just enough to create a modicum of investment, tension, and consequence. And this one of the lessons I learned in undergrad when I took a screenwriting class is never be afraid to bloody your characters. And this movie shows no fear in doing that. Primate may not operate on the same psychological or thematic level as something like Cujo, but it very much is in that same ballpark. It's lean, mean, and built around the primal terror of losing control when nature decides to push back. Today, we're talking about what Primate does right, why When Nature Attacks movies still work, and what this film suggests about the enduring power of straightforward genre storytelling. Joining me for today's review discussion is returning guest, friend of the show, and fellow film critic Sean Bowman. Welcome back, Sean.
Thank you for having me. And I know you say I'm a returning guest, but I realized something earlier, and I think this is my first time being on the show for a new release review. I
I
think I,
think I think it is too.
I think I've
We
only
the
ever
last
joined you for like the retrospectives and the rankings.
That's right. So it's first for a new review. Of course, this movie's not exactly new for you. You saw it in the festival circuit a while back, but for most of the population, they're seeing it here in the first couple of weeks of January. So thank you very much for coming and joining us to talk about this movie, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. Listeners, as a just if you in case you do not remember, Sean is a member of the Critics Choice Association and the Critics Association of Central Florida, of which I too am a member. He's a writer and editor for the fan site website Fandom Wire. Many of you have probably read reviews on that website, and I'm going to get right into it here, Sean, because we got a lot that we really can talk about, even though the premise of this movie is very, very simple, but perhaps it's like that little black dress. The beauty is in its simplicity. So Primate, makes no attempt, in my opinion, to disguise its straightforward genre DNA. It proudly announces itself as a when nature attacks movie, and this is taking place in an era obsessed with subversion and reinvention. And what I want to know from you is, why does this kind of straightforward genre confidence feel almost radical?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues with film today, and I might be a little controversial among the cinephile community here, is that a lot of people are necessitating films to be longer than they need to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the real charming things about Primate is that it's this 85-minute movie like I think it's like 89 including credits.
Yeah, it's
In and out.
not even an hour and a half.
Yeah.
This thing clocks in from the first title card to the last. No animals were harmed in the making of this movie. It is less than 90 minutes.
Right. And so like I think that you have this film that's really nice and lean and mean, and it's something that we're not really seeing in the cinemas anymore. And it's because a lot of people want to maximize their film
Mm-hmm.
going experiences so that they feel like they're getting their money's worth.
Mm-hmm.
People are now paying 10, 15, $20 even
Yeah.
for a movie ticket. And so now the conventional wisdom has become, well, if we're going to have them pay 10, 15, $20 for a movie ticket, we need to
Mm-hmm.
give them 2 hours of movie. We need to give them 2.5 hours of movie.
Mm.
And while I think there are plenty of great movies that
Oh
are long,
yeah.
like The Godfather is a long movie and it's a great film. I don't
Once
think
Upon a
that,
Time in Hollywood, and I
yeah,
saw that 3 times in the cinema, and it's what, 245, two
something like that.
fifty. Yeah.
But like there are is such a good thing as a
Mm-hmm.
very long film. But a movie called Primate doesn't need to be 100 minutes even. It
No.
definitely doesn't need to be 2 hours. So I
Mm-mm.
think what makes it feel so radical is that we have this movie that is so compressed. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't feel like it needs to outstay its welcome
Mm-hmm.
to be entertaining and to
Mm-hmm.
give the audience what they paid for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Um, in fact, you've given me something to think about. While I agree with you, I had never thought about the cost of the movie ticket in terms of length of the movie, and so that's a dimension that I hadn't considered before, and so I'm so glad you brought that up because it could very well be what some people may use, whether consciously or unconsciously, to determine if the $15-20 movie ticket is worth it. If they see a movie is 80 minutes long, they're going to think, oh gosh, I don't want to spend $15-20 for 80 minutes.
Right.
Uh,
Because then
it,
it's not really like a full night out in that way.
no.
But I think this film does justify
Hmm.
like its short length. It gives the audience what they are buying the ticket to see in that 80 minutes. And I think that's what works about it.
I think something else that works to its favor is, and why it may feel a bit radical is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, um, that we don't get very many straightforward genre movies, even in horror anymore, and it's been like that for quite a while. And that's not to suggest there are not. There's not a vacuum. There's not a complete absence. But from my vantage point, there does appear to be far fewer genre horror films, and we could say that about a lot of genres, but we're talking about horror here, so I'm gonna kind of keep it to that. We don't have we don't have as many, and that could maybe it is because if you do straightforward genre, maybe it just naturally lends itself to a shorter runtime, and when you go for something that's more slow burn, perhaps psychological in nature, highly atmospheric. Although this movie's got some great atmosphere, folks, but with the more atmospheric, perhaps that lends itself to to the longer film. So maybe that's why. I mean, do you think there's any truth in that? That straightforward genre, by its very nature, is more likely to be a quote shorter movie than its more atmospheric psychological counterpart.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. And I also think that there's some truth to, I feel like every straightforward genre is disappearing from the
Hmm.
theaters for
Yeah.
the most part. We're having a lot of things that are blurring the lines that are fitting this mold of PG-13,
Hmm.
pretty action oriented,
Yeah.
lots of wisecracking jokes.
Hmm.
For lack of a better word, the MCU formula.
Yeah.
Even if it's not a superhero movie, it
Hmm.
has like a similar tone of that. Of like some a great example would be like Anaconda, which is a film I did enjoy. I really did enjoy Anaconda, but that is, the original Anaconda is this creature feature horror film,
Yeah.
and this version of Anaconda is a PG-13 action movie
Mm-hmm.
with heavy comedic elements.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we're losing a lot of those lines. There are obviously exceptions. I think this is one of
Mm-hmm.
those exceptions where it's like a quote pure horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of comedy, last year's Naked Gun was
Oh yeah.
another
Oh, agree
pure comedy,
wholeheartedly.
and perhaps not coincidentally, that film I think was like under 80 minutes when you got rid of
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
including the credits. So again, like I think it's just like right now the multiplexes are dominated by this formula where it's blending genres, but not in a way that's like stimulating, in a way that is playing into that
Mm-hmm.
archetype. And I feel like that's in a way why Primate feels a bit against the grain, even though it is a very classical film in many senses.
Yeah, I'd say the last time I feel I saw this, or at least the last time that's leaping to my mind, is 2019, 1819 Crawl. I think it might have been 2019. And Crawl was also like this. It was another one. Didn't expect to like it as much as I did. I saw that sucker 3 times in the cinema, and it did very well by audiences and by critics. If I remember correctly, did very well at the box office. Another When Nature Attacks movie. So I think a fair comparison to this one, I'd say Primate is definitely more intense, but still they're both in that same ballpark. And so it reminds me a lot of what I recall about Crawl and just how refreshing it was when Crawl hit theaters. Do you see similarities between Crawl and Primate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a few others, obviously, that come to mind in terms of pure
Mm-hmm.
horror films, and a lot of them have been successful. So, like last year, I know it was one of your favorite films of the year was the Final Destination Bloodlines.
Oh yes.
I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that would be like very pure
Mm-hmm.
horror, and that was very successful. Hard Eyes is another one that came
Mm-hmm.
out last year. That one
Yeah,
has a little bit more of like the comedic element
it
into it,
does.
like in terms of like the rom com. But that one I think is very close to like a pure slasher,
Mm-hmm.
in that way. And then I think some other commercial like the Smile films.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very uh, they do have like a metaphor about like depression, but
Yeah.
those are very clearly like classical horror
Mm-hmm.
movies where it's like this monster movie, very high concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like they still come around a couple of them a year,
Mm-hmm.
but not as much as they used to.
Yeah, and probably horror is one of the genres where we find, while evaporating straightforward genre movies may be, it's probably the genre where we find the most with as few, perhaps as there are to go around. One of the things that I noted about the movie was its pacing. Great pacing. And you know how stickler I am for classical writing, 3 act structure, big event, crisis, all that jazz. And I loved seeing that in this movie. And I think this movie in part succeeds because the pacing never lets that tension evaporate. Do you agree with that, Sean? And if so, or if not, why? And what else about the writing, about the pacing, stood out to you? Because I don't feel anything in there ever overcomplicates this, rather simple narrative.
No, I absolutely agree. I think it's very well paced film, and I think a lot of the secret and the sauce, if we want to call it that,
Mm-hmm.
of the success of this film is its location. So like
Oh
we
yeah.
are primarily set in this house, and it's a very big house.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very luxurious house, but we get introduced to this house in the beginning of the film. They basically take us on a tour of the house
Mm-hmm.
without taking us on a tour of the house.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we know where the story is going to be moving through. Like we start where we start. which is mostly in the pool, I would say, is like where the action starts. And
Yes.
then obviously I'm not going to go into spoilers about what happens from there, but like obviously we see the action move through the house. And it's
Hmm.
not like they were just creating a bunch of different kill scenes.
Yeah.
They seem to have very precisely planned out like how is this action going to move through this setting that we have
Hmm.
established and built. And I think that's what makes it paced so well, is that we know where it's going geographically,
Hmm.
even if we don't know how they're going to get there. And I think that's what kept me invested at least.
Yeah, the beautiful location in Hawaii on the edge of a cliff. I mean, talk about a Verbo or Airbnb that to die for. And so it was just absolutely breathtaking. And I love that how we have this breathtakingly beautiful backdrop against this carnage. And so I love that juxtaposition there. Yeah, at the very beginning of the movie, there's a kill. That's not a spoiler, folks. You're going to go into this movie, you expect there to be something at the beginning, but the thing is, it actually happens. We get it within what was it, 2 minutes, Sean? I don't
Yeah.
even think we made it to 3 minutes, and we've got a kill at the very beginning, and you pretty much learn everything you need to know about the rules of this primate right there in the first couple of minutes of the movie, and then you are hooked because you know what is to come. We back up a little bit, maybe a day earlier, half a day earlier, so we back up a little bit, so we know eventually we're getting to the point that on which the scene in which the movie opens. But I was hooked right there, like, oh my gosh, they went there. You mentioned PG-13 horror earlier, and so we don't get the carnage that we used to. I would say we don't get the tasteful carnage. There's certainly still a lot of torture porn movies out there, which I do not care for, so I would say more restrained carnage. Even though this movie does have it's punctuated with some very intense moments, folks. So it does not shy away from the gore, but I'd say within the world that these filmmakers have created, I still find it's within reasonable expectation of what you would what you're looking for in these movies. And uh, the as we move through the narrative, I I couldn't help but notice where I could almost remember diagramming sentences in
Mhm.
school. I could see myself diagramming this movie because it was very clear where our first act transitioned into the second act, and our second act transitioned into the third act, and our first and third acts are much shorter than the second act, which is classically speaking the way it is quote supposed to be. And so no time is wasted. I feel these filmmakers took a page out of Hitchcock's book. With he famously says, and I'm paraphrasing, that a scene should start as close to the end of the scene as possible, and each one of these scenes almost feels like a mini movie in and of itself. There's setup, development, and resolution in each and every one of these scenes, and they are all pointing towards the end of the film. No time is wasted. But hey, at 85 minutes, you can't afford to waste any time. So
Right.
it's very lean and mean, and I never once looked at my watch, and I've said this on the show before, and I think I've even said it to you, is that I know if I look at my watch, I'm at least to some degree, however, mild or moderate, I'm disengaged from the movie. I never once looked at my watch the entire time. And I took note of that because there's been a lot of movies, particularly in recent years, in which I look down at my watch. I'm like, oh my gosh, has it only been this? Has it only been that long? Or how much longer is this movie going to go? And I never did that with this movie. Do you recall looking at your watch at all as you were watching it?
No, not really. And I think your point about like diagramming quote the
Mhm.
story is interesting. Because I think with horror movies, a lot of times I end up, for lack of a better word, rewriting them in my
Mm.
head of like, okay, this is where it should go, and then it goes somewhere else that's dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And my thing of this was I was like thinking along with the movie, and it was going where it should have gone, but not
Mm-hmm.
in a bad way.
Yeah.
Like there are some movies recently, that I would say I was always like 10 steps ahead of, and I
Mm-hmm.
got bored with the movie because I was 10 steps ahead of it.
Ah.
But this one, I felt like it flowed out very naturally. Like this is the
Mm-hmm.
way that this story is supposed to progress,
Mm-hmm.
and it delivers what it's supposed to deliver in a very satisfying way.
Could agree very much so. Well, I want to talk more about our characters, but let's go ahead and do that after our break, which is coming up next. You're listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, RL Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic Sean Bowman. Today we are reviewing the recently released horror movie Primate, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, RL Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic Sean Bowman. This hour, we are reviewing the recently released horror movie Primate. And so, before the break, Sean, we talk a lot about what's really the writing. It's the storytelling of this film and the plotting. And what I want to shift to now are our characters. Because while not every character is fully dimensional, I'd say most of Primate's characters are sufficiently developed. They're developed just enough to serve the story, in my opinion, anyway. What's your overall opinion of our movie's characters, both our leads and our supporting and bit players?
So my thought process on this might be slightly different than yours, and I'd be
Okay,
interested to hear yours. But
sure.
mine is that I don't really think the character development for the human characters in this matters at all. I
Ah.
don't think there's a need to develop any of the human characters.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because there's enough development for the ape at the beginning
Mm.
of the movie that we get to meet the ape, and over
Mm-hmm.
maybe 10-15 minutes
Mm-hmm.
we like the ape.
Yeah.
He's a nice monkey,
Mm-hmm.
and he's cute, and he talks using a tablet,
Mm-hmm.
and he feels fleshed out, and then we feel bad for him when he gets infected with rabies,
Mm.
which we know is
Yeah.
going to happen. And
Mhm.
so for the rest of the movie, I wasn't necessarily rooting for the characters to survive as much as I was
Oh.
rooting for the monkey to not kill them.
Interesting.
And
No, I
like I said,
hadn't
I
thought
think
of
that's a
that.
different perspective,
Yeah.
but I think that's why the character development or lack thereof in the movie worked for me. And it
Mhm.
was because like I found myself this whole time like, no, don't kill them, was like my thought.
Ah. I hadn't thought about that before. Um, but that is something that this movie's done that I'd venture to say most When Nature Attacks movies haven't done. Even great ones like Cujo, and we do get to know Cujo before he's also infected with rabies. But I agree with you that we get to know Ben, our chimp, even more than we get to know Cujo, and we do feel for him, particularly when uh, the our author, I forget the dad's name, but when like he's going down to check on him and he points to the bite and it's noticed, and I hadn't considered that being an influence on my interpretation of the movie's characters. So thank you for giving that alternate perspective. And maybe that's actually why I find that the characters are sufficiently developed. While I'm thinking it's the characters, you've just highlighted it might not have been the characters themselves, the human characters themselves at all. Maybe it is our chimp Ben. With our movie characters, though, I like that we have relatively small cast. It's not too bloated. We get a lot of bloated cast these days, so I like that we don't have too many. We get to know them all right at the very beginning. Even our couple of guys that come in, a little bit later on in the movie, in the tail end of the second act, meet them on the airplane, and we establish the relationship between the sisters, between the friends, and they feel like real people. Where they've got this, a couple of them are kind of more frenemies than maybe they are friends, and the younger sister is the sisters are a little estranged. The one that's back in Hawaii, and they felt like real characters. And I like our character of the father because he reminds me of someone whom, if they are, I'm guessing he's a best-selling author, considering he can afford that house. Because I don't think the late wife, who was a linguistics professor, probably paid for that house. so, so I take it that he's best-selling author. But he, how his relationship, because like he has a good relationship, but he's also distracted by his work and those responsibilities, and I can see that if we were him, maybe we'd find ourselves facing similar struggles and not always succeeding maybe where we should or would want to in terms of the relationship with our closest family and friends. So they all felt very real. I don't think any of them felt synthesized or manufactured. They felt very real within their world, and I like that, particularly Lucy. We really get to know her, and it's so I was rooting not for all of their survival. Some of them are like, yes, you needed to go, but enough of them I was like, even playfully so, because it's one of those simultaneous things, like, you're kind of amped for the next kill scene, but I need you to survive. But if you survive, then I don't get my kill scene. So which which of these do I want? And but I next time I watch it, and I think I will. I think this is one that I will rewatch. I'm gonna look for that to see, is it really am I actually invested in the human characters, or am I really invested in Ben? And I just didn't pick up on that the first time. So I'm gonna look for that. Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. It's very interesting point there. Um, One of the things I have noticed, and you probably noticed the same thing in talking horror films here. And again, it's something that folks, listeners by extension, you can apply some of these arguments to other genres, but we're talking about a horror movie here. One of the things I've noticed is that there's just this intentional writers and directors, or nowadays it's writer director. You and I have had many conversations about my feelings of writer director versus you are a writer and you over there are a director. I digress. That they strive for this allegorical, metaphorical storytelling that's highly thematic, and like that's what they're going for, and then somehow they just try to cram a plot into the allegory, the metaphor that they are trying to create. And it's not all movies, but certainly that seems to be not even a trend anymore, almost a status quo. Like that's what you go out there to create. But Primate isn't interested in any of that, but it still taps into something very primal. Horror after all. Why do so many of us love horror films? And I mentioned this in my upcoming book that comes out in October, Monsters, Madness, and Mayhem: Why People Love Horror. In part, it is primal fear that unites us. And there's something very primal about the fear of nature, the loss of control, and our own vulnerability as humans. why do these themes remain so effective, even without the overt symbolism that seems to be pervasive in a lot of horror movies these days?
Yeah, I think it's because the fear in Primate is real. It is based on a pet getting infected with rabies,
Hmm.
which a lot of pet owners are afraid of, is
Hmm.
having their pet get infected with rabies, or
Hmm.
to be a little more macabre, like people will joke like, "Oh, is my cat gonna eat me if I die in my sleep?" or
Hmm.
something like that.
Yeah.
Like those are things that people actually think about.
Hmm.
So I think that that's a big part of why Primate does feel somewhat scary.
Hmm.
Of course, you and I are never going to buy an exotic pet like like
No.
like a chimpanzee.
Uh-uh.
So like
No.
obviously for the average person, there's not a whole lot of fear that our pet monkey is going to kill us,
Hmm.
but there's still some verisimilitude to
Hmm.
that. And I think a big part of why this film also emotionally resonates is because, as we were talking about with the character development, they develop very early on that, like, a lot of people say that their pets are their family members, and they
Hmm.
establish very early on that the chimp Ben is like a family member to them.
Yeah.
So, like, for the main character, this would be like if her brother were
Hmm.
attacking her friends
Yeah.
and loved ones, which, that is, it's also, that side of things is also a little more believable, I think,
Hmm.
because of the evolutionary similarities between primates and
Hmm.
men. They are like one step away from us versus, dogs
Hmm.
are completely different from us. So yeah, like I think that is where a lot of the resonance and the fear comes from, are those two things of it being grounded in a real threat and it being
Hmm.
grounded in this emotional connection.
Yeah, and I think some of that emotional connection, and you talk about being like family, and I'm so glad they didn't name the chimp Michael. And it's like my brother. Then it's my brother Michael, and so I'm glad we went with a different name there. But it's the connection to their mom, who we don't know a lot about. We know she was a linguistics professor, and Ben was and we'll call him an individual with whom she worked a lot in her research. And so when they're looking at Ben, there is a it was almost like kind of a latent image of their mother. Not literally, but it's because of the connection that their mom had to Ben. When they see Ben, I think they're reminded of their mom, which is probably why it even pained them more. And they were in pain, when
Yep.
they're seeing, even after Ben did some of the things he did, they still feel this pain. And I wonder if it is because of that connection that Ben represented to their mom, whom passed away, I think they said a few years prior.
Yeah, I could definitely see that also being another angle.
Mhm.
Like I think, as simplistic as you claim the film is, and I do think
Mhm.
it is simple in many ways, I don't think it's necessarily without thought.
No, no, no.
And
Deceptively simple,
yeah,
deceptively
that
simplistic,
that that
perhaps.
that would be a
Okay.
good way to put it, I think.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, there are some dumb moments in it, as there are in any
Yeah.
creature feature, where you're like, okay, this is a convenience, or this is a character making a bad decision because that's what they have to
Mhm.
do to die.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a lot more thought put into this than you would expect from a movie about a killer ape.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Mentioned movie Cujo earlier. Reminded me of Cujo. Crawl is another one. And I think comparisons to movies like Cujo and Crawl are inevitable. Even if Primate doesn't reach the same, say, psychological depth that Cujo does, I say it's probably on par. Actually, I'd say it's even better than Crawl in that respect. So, So it sits somewhere in between Crawl and Cujo. What similarities or even differences do you see between Cujo and Crawl and Primate? Because they all work incredibly well. What is it that each of them do that you feel kind of captures this bit of cinematic magic?
I think one of the things that this, if you want to call it like a subgenre
Hmm.
of films, does well is that like it traps our characters in circumstances
Hmm.
that they could theoretically get out of,
Hmm.
but it's difficult for them to get out of.
Hmm.
So, like, you have these situations like in Primate, and I don't want to go into spoilers, where
Hmm.
there are escape routes that
Hmm.
they can take, and they try to take the escape routes, and inevitably, the escape routes don't turn out the way they think.
Hmm. No.
So like yes, like there is the easy solution of I can lock myself in my bedroom that this chimp can't bust down the door because he's not
Hmm.
strong enough to bust down the door. Um, but then like you have this whole other story, like if you went down that route of like,
Hmm.
okay, now I'm trapped in a bedroom for the rest of
Yeah.
my life, basically,
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
can't get out. So
Uh-huh.
like it's one of those situations where it's like all of these are there's no good answer
Hmm.
versus like I think horror movies with like maybe like human protagonist or human antagonists, I should
Hmm.
say, like you can just be like, okay, I'm gonna leave Haddonfield,
Yeah.
and Michael
That's true,
Myers is not
yeah.
gonna be coming with me. Um, like if I'm like I see there's a string of killings in Haddonfield, I'm
Mhm,
getting out of Haddonfield.
mhm. Don't head for Woodsboro, they got the same problem.
Right, exactly. But like with something like this, it's confined to that location of
Mhm,
like even if I tried to like lock myself in my room,
mhm.
I have another problem. And so I
Yeah.
feel like it's that fact that it's like these problems compounding on one another
Mm.
that makes this subgenre work.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, in Cujo we have the car. Crawl we have house, but we're in the basement. And then in this one we have a house. Also get a little car moment at some point in the movie, but it's mostly our house. And so it's the confined and in which there are exits, but to what end? It's like just because you can maybe be safe for quite a while, but then you become a prisoner. And it's just like I can't continue to be a prisoner of my own house. They couldn't have set this story in a better location in a house that's right along a cliffside, because and I thought that at some point like, well, just run for the car, but then there are attempts to do that, and if you want to know what happens, listeners, you just have to go and watch the movie. And so I like the you don't want to be a prisoner of our house, of our own homes. Now, there's something that I want to get into that I'm going to wait until after our next break. So we'll go to our next break just a little bit early because the next question I have for you, Sean, is one that I think we're probably going to differ on, but I love that. So I can't wait to get into it. Listeners, you are listening to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic Sean Bowman. Today we are reviewing the recently released horror movie Primate, so don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC. I'm your host, R.L. Terry, and today I am joined by returning guest and friend of the show, film critic Sean Bowman. This hour, we are reviewing the recently released horror movie Primate. And so, Sean, something that, and again, I think we're going to differ a little bit on this, but just like the episode in which Gino and I couldn't have been, more different from one another. And gosh, which movie was I'm trying to remember now, but it was fun because he and I were total opposites on the movie, and this is something that you and I have talked at length about just in our own conversations. Uh, so I'm just gonna rip off the band-aid and get right into it here. So creature features often rise or fall on execution rather than originality. And I think you and I can agree there. In your view, what aspects of Primate's execution elevate it above other more disposable genre fare? And if I could go a little bit further, I also want to touch on how this horror movie defies the what I describe as, and this is I know where we differ a little, describe uh, as the proliferation of quote prestige horror movies that companies like, and I'm going to call them out, that A24 or Neon, whether they're original or not, whether they're original to them or they buy them at festivals, that they are putting out that are uh, oftentimes critic darlings. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think first question, what do I think works about Primate that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
work about, like disposable movies?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it is the commitment to practical effects.
Mm-hmm.
I love seeing an old school practical effects driven movie, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot, not all, obviously, but a lot of what happens in Primate is practical. So like
Yes, it
most of the
is.
scenes are a man in the ape suit. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a CGI ape, uh, which is as impressive as like Andy Serkis's
Mm-hmm.
performance capture work in the Planet of the Apes movies
Mm-hmm.
is. I would not have wanted to see
No.
Primate with that.
Uh-uh.
Like
Definitely not.
that wouldn't have worked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that extends to the gore as well. Like we
Mm-hmm.
see this carnage like
Mm-hmm.
happens without like CGI blood
Mm-hmm.
or like any of that like we don't see it turn into like for lack of a better word an R-rated cartoon. Like it feels real.
Yeah.
So I think that that's what elevates
Mm-hmm.
Primate. But in terms of like the quote elevated or prestige horror,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's room for both
Mm-hmm.
in the marketplace, and I think something that you will agree with me on
Okay.
is that this is because horror has always been thoughtful,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and I think like maybe not since like the very beginnings, but I feel
Mm-hmm.
like there is certainly an analog to what we would call prestige horror,
Mm-hmm.
uh, dating back to at least the 50s. Like if
Yeah.
you look back to the sci-fi horror of the 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
you have these movies that are metaphors for the Cold War.
Right.
Um, and then you look back at the slashers of the 70s and 80s, and those
Mm-hmm.
movies are pretty clearly metaphors. And so I think you have those films are in contrast to the rest of the horror films that were coming out
Mm-hmm.
in those decades. And obviously, they look different than what we have now as
Mm-hmm.
our like our quote A24 slash neon horror.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you contrasted the day the earth stood still from the
Mm-hmm.
50s to Halloween,
Mm-hmm.
the day the earth stood still doesn't feel radical, it feels old, it
Mm-hmm.
feels like old hat. If you compare Halloween to something like you know one like Hereditary,
Mm-hmm.
it feels older, it
Mm-hmm.
feels like something of a bygone era. So I feel like, but you look back at the day the earth stood still and you look back at Halloween, and both of those films are revolutionary in their time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that when we have that, um, we're looking at things like we have to look at things contained within the context in which they're operating.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like in a way those A24 and neon movies are the slasher movies of today,
Hmm.
or the sci-fi horror movies of the 50s that are like going against the grain of
Mm-hmm.
everything else that we're getting in horror.
See, and I could mostly agree with that, but I think where I differ is it really comes down to this. And again, while there are objective elements in film criticism, I know you and I can agree there. There are subjective dynamic, subjective approaches as well. And so I'm not going to claim this is objective. There's some subjectivity in it, but I still think it's a point worth discussing or exploring. That where I find a lot of fault with what A24 Neon put out, again, whether it's original to them or they bought it at Fantastic Fest, is I don't find that the films they tend to distribute are as strongly plotted. I'm not going to say not as well written, but I will say as strongly plotted as say this movie is, and because their plots tend to be very out there. I find that their writer directors often pass ambiguity as high art. And it's like, no, dude, you just have a poorly plotted movie. You're just trying to convince me because of your technical achievement and how beautiful it looks that you've created something masterful when your plotting is terrible. And it's also the entertainment value. I find that, and not all, but many, particularly in more recent years, that much of what companies like A24 and Neon, and there's others out there, folks, these are the easy ones to pick on, that they lack the entertainment value, that the movies forget, okay, we don't all need to be incredibly thought-provoking. Maybe we should start with entertaining people, and we can get that more thoughtful subtext in there. We can code characters and code plots, and we can get these these more esoteric ideas in there without ever losing our focus on we are motion pictures that for the most part are here to entertain. And that's where I think Primate succeeds over so much of what they put out. In this, again, personal opinion, I don't find that most of their movies are entertaining. What do you have to say to that?
Yeah, no, I get that, and I think that's fair in some ways, and I think that some of the A24 and Neon and other studios that are doing this, maybe aren't necessarily going for entertain with some of these as much as they
Mm-hmm.
are with scare or disturb.
Mm-hmm.
um, which I think that some of them are very effective at doing that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are some studio horror films that are like more conventional quote that go more
Mm-hmm.
for scare slash disturb than entertain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A good example that I can think of is Evil Dead Rise,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
the reboot of the Evil Dead franchise, which I
Mm-hmm.
loved that film, and I think that one went less for fun than it did
Mm-hmm.
for scare slash disturb.
Mm-hmm.
Versus I think Primate obviously is going more for fun than scare slash
Mm-hmm.
disturb. But I think that there are certainly still films from those like indie studios, those art house
Mm-hmm.
studios that are going for that fun. I know you disagree with me on this one, but I think a
Mm-hmm.
good example of one of those is the Dave Franco movie Together. I think that that one has a very
Mm-hmm.
um, classical plot structure in which you can almost compare that one to um, like Evil Dead in a way, where it's like they go into the woods, they find this scary ancient, instead of a book like it was in the Evil Dead, they find this ancient water well. They do something they're not supposed to do with it, and then a bunch of bad stuff happens to them, and then they have to find the way to um, reverse the bad stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
then they don't find a way to reverse the bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel like in many ways that story very closely mirrors like the story of Evil Dead, which I think is a prototype for a lot of the modern studio driven or more conventional horror films
Mm-hmm.
that we're seeing today. So I think that there is still room for both. I'm obviously not going going to sit here and advocate for a movie that's just like a montage of random images. Although I think that there's, sorry, I think that there is some merit in some films that are
Mm-hmm.
just montages of random images. I think Experimental films have their place and can be
Mm-hmm.
very good
Yeah.
if the filmmaker knows what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like looping or lumping all of these films
Mm-hmm.
into one category um, is not necessarily accepting the full breadth of what they
Mm-hmm.
can be.
Yeah, that it's fair. Okay, so we could agree on a lot of points here. Maybe disagree on one or two, and I think that's good. So we kind of meet somewhere here in the middle. And at the end of the day, and I know you know this, that I do know there's room for both, but it's just like I feel as though I have to come to the defense of the genre movie, because as I look around me at a lot of the different film critics with whom I interact, it's just like you're so quick to champion as soon as A24 Neon drops a title, you're like, oh, 100% Rotten Tomatoes, just like without even really thinking about it.
Yeah,
Or you're just like, oh, well, they put it out, so it's going to be good. It has to be good. Well, you just didn't get it. It's because I hear all of that that I feel this drive to come to the defense and die on the hill of classically written and produced genre movies.
yeah. And I will say, in my defense, even though I do often enjoy A24 and neon
Mm-hmm.
horror films, I will call them out when they are not good.
Yeah. And you will, and you
And
have. I respect that.
I will defend movies like Primate when they are good. So I'm willing to play both sides here.
Yeah, and it is, folks, and it's new, so we don't want to get into spoilers. So, listeners, it is a lot of fun. You're gonna get, if you enjoy When Nature Attacks movies, you're gonna get everything you like about those movies in here. Sean, I'm so glad you brought up the practical effects, which I'm ashamed that I did not write that in my notes for our show today. But we still got a few minutes here before we need to wrap it up. So why don't we talk about that? You bring up a very good point that in an age wherein it would have been very easy to get, Andy Serkis or an Andy Serkis type. And again, not knocking the work that he does. It's brilliant, brilliant work, and I don't think anybody else is ever going to do it as well as he does. So that withstanding, in an age in which you could easily do that, and maybe it's even cheaper than all the costuming for our chimpanzee, the filmmakers chose not to do that. And even though I think there's some CG enhancement in some of our kills because of what they are,
For sure.
I'm not gonna put a percentage. Well, we'll just say 75% CGI. I mean, I'm sorry, 75% practical. Maybe a quarter of it is CG, but so we have a lot of that, and it sets it apart from other movies. And in an age in which it would have been cheaper to do the CG, they lean into the practical. And I agree with you that had we had a CG chimp the whole time, had we had virtually all CG kills, I don't think you and I would be talking about this movie as positively as we are now. Um, do you feel that movies like Primate and some others that have come out in recent years that have leaned into practical effects, do you think maybe we're on a trend that is back to that, if not in whole, at least in parts? And you see more movies than I do. Listeners, I see a lot of movies, but I do not see nearly as many as Sean does. And so Sean is always watching way more movies, and so I know that if there's a trend out there, he's going to be able to identify it. So do you think, or am I just looking for a trend and looking for ways to support it, but maybe it's not there? What do you think about this?
No, I think you're onto something. I think there is a greater trend in filmmaking in general uh, of going back to analog, just in
Mm-hmm.
general. So we see like another good example would be like um, Christopher Nolan and Ryan Coogler and Paul Thomas Anderson and Brady Corbet all shooting on these like extinct film formats
Mm-hmm.
and bringing them back from the dead because they like the look of these extinct film formats.
Mm.
So like I feel like we're seeing a similar thing in horror where it's like these approaches to effects might have been gone extinct because they found new ways to do them and people forgot how to do the old way,
Mm.
or you can't pay to do it the old way anymore because it's too expensive to do it the old
Mm-hmm.
way, or stuff like that. And I feel like we have these people who grew up with that was the only way,
Mm-hmm.
who are wanting to bring it back. So I feel like that is definitely a trend that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I guess we can't all afford to hire Rick Baker to work on to
Right.
work on our movies, or Tom Savini. But their students are still out there, and so I hope that we continue to see this, because it just gets under your skin a little bit more, because it's just like, oh my gosh, I could touch that, I could see dimensional lighting, and there's such definition, and it's even when you're cognizant that it's fake, when it's something that is real and tangible on the set, I think it does crawl under your skin just just a bit more than when you see the CG. And so I'm so glad that the movie really leaned into that, all the way down to the costuming, and it was very impressive. But I'm afraid we're gonna have to leave it here, Sean. Thank you so much for once again joining us on Real Talk today.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's always a joy
Oh,
to come on.
Oh, you're very welcome. In case listeners want to follow, or read your reviews, how can they, connect or follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. My reviews can be found on fandomwire.com, and I'm on the social media platforms like Instagram, X, and Letterboxd as at Big Tuna on Film.
Excellent, excellent. And so, folks, if you want to know, what's coming out soon, Sean, does his best to attend as many of the festivals as he can with his time. So if it's coming out there, he will probably have some thoughts on it. Well, next week, Real Talk will be back with author Debbie Pollock. She wrote the fascinating book Bringing Up Oscar. So join us for an engaging discussion on the Oscars, and perhaps why it's lost its luster and maybe even relevance. You don't want to miss the conversation. If you missed any of today's episode, or to listen to past episodes of Real Talk or other shows on WKGC, we are on a podcatcher near you. Just search for WKGC Public Media on your podcast service of choice. Stay tuned for Jazz in a Minor Key with Walter Hale coming up next. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you'll tune in again next week, same time, same place, for more Real Talk on 90.7 WKGC.